All right, diving in today, folks. We're all about Inkscape. Yeah, that free open source vector graphics powerhouse. It's kind of a big deal, right? Whether you're a design pro or just starting out, Inkscape is seriously versatile.
Couldn't agree more. And the pile of guides and blog posts you've given me, wow, it's a gold mine.
It is, right. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We're going to extract the core, the essence of Inkscape, and hand it to you, our listeners. Think of it as a super concentrated shot of Inkscape knowledge, ready to boost your skills.
Perfect analogy. We've got the interface basics, creating stuff, manipulating paths, getting fancy with effects, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. So no matter where you are on your Inkscape journey, this deep dive is going to have those aha moments for you. I guarantee it.
All right, let's crack this thing open. Now, when you first fire up Inkscape, you usually get that welcome dialogue. What's the point of that thing?
The welcome dialogues. It's like setting the stage before the play. You can customize your document even before you start drawing. A lot of people don't realize how much control you have right there. So it's not just about aesthetics. It's about setting up for success. The sources mentioned playing with canvas appearance, things like the background color, but that doesn't actually affect your final artwork, right? It's just visual preference.
You got it. Like, think of your desktop wallpaper. It's there for you, makes things comfy, but doesn't get printed out with your documents. Same idea. The canvas color, it won't show up in your exported file. It's just there while you work.
Gotcha. So what about keyboard shortcuts? Can you mess with those too?
Oh, absolutely. Inkscape lets you customize those. But honestly, if you're new, stick with the defaults for a bit. You'll build that muscle memory, and then later you can go wild and remap everything.
Makes sense. Don't want to overload right out of the gate. Anything else in that welcome dialogue worth mentioning?
Oh, yeah. You can change how those little icons look. That's just personal taste, really.
Yeah.
And of course, the big one, dark mode.
Ah, yes. Gotta save those eyeballs. Especially for those late-night design sessions. Essential stuff. Now, what if you accidentally close that welcome dialogue? Is it gone forever?
No way. It's always there. Mac users, head to the Inkscape menu, Preferences. Windows folks, it's under the Edit menu, Preferences. Then just search Welcome, and boom, you'll see that Show Welcome dialog checkbox. Click it, and you're good to go. It'll either pop up right away, or you'll see it next time you launch Inkscape.
Always there when you need it. Handy. And there's something about templates too, right? In the welcome dialogue, those seem pretty powerful.
Oh, templates are a lifesaver. They're in the Time to Draw section, all set up with specific dimensions. Like, think about designing a poster or a business card. Instead of starting from scratch, you grab a template that's already the right size. Super efficient.
Yeah, I can see that. No more guessing and resizing later. So they have templates for common print sizes.
Yep, A4, US letter, you name it. But it goes way beyond that. Templates for video, for social media posts, even for specific screen resolutions.
So if I wanted to design, say, a YouTube thumbnail, there's a template ready to go.
You bet. Just click and start designing, saves you tons of time. They even have templates for icons and patterns, and if you need something really specific, you can create your own custom templates and save them. Talk about ultimate customization.
Wow, that's next level. Okay, so you've picked your template or maybe just started with the default setup. Now you're looking at the canvas, that big gray space, and the page, that white rectangle in the middle. What's the difference there?
The canvas versus the page. Classic confusion. Think of it like the canvas is your whole workspace, right? It can be huge.
Yeah.
The page is the part that actually gets exported, printed, or shared. Think of it like a frame for your final artwork.
Okay, so I can actually draw anywhere on that massive canvas, but the page is like the viewfinder, showing what will end up in the final product.
Exactly. And here's another thing. The colors of the canvas and page, they don't matter in the end. They're just there for your eyes while you're working. When you export, it's all transparent. So that gray canvas won't show up as a gray background in your PNG or anything like that.
Oh, good to know. Wouldn't want any surprises there. So what if you need to change the page size or orientation after you've started?
Document Properties is your friend. Go to File, Document Properties, and you can change everything. The format, custom dimensions, portrait or landscape, even what units you're working in, millimeters, pixels, inches.
So that's like the control center for the whole document. Cool. Okay, let's look at the interface itself. There's a lot going on. We've got toolbars, panels, all sorts of stuff. Where do we even start?
All right, let's break it down. On the left, we've got the toolbox. All your tools live there. Shapes, pens, text, the works. You can actually resize that toolbox too if you need more space for your drawing. Just grab the edge and drag.
Nice. Handy if you're on a smaller screen. What about that bar, usually on the right?
That, my friend, is the commands bar. Think of it as your quick access panel. New document, open, save, all that good stuff. Undo, redo, copy, paste, they're all there. It usually hangs out on the right,
Yeah.
but you can move it to the top if you want a more traditional layout.
Options, options. I like it. And what about that bar at the very top?
That's the controls bar. And this one's smart. It changes depending on what tool you're using. So if you've got the rectangle tool selected, the controls bar will show you options for that rectangle with height, corner rounding, all that.
So it's like it knows what you're thinking, always giving you the relevant options. And then below the canvas, we've got that long strip of colored squares. That's the color palette, right?
Yep, that's it. Super handy for changing colors. Select your object, click a color, boom, it's filled. Want an outline? Shift-click. Easy peasy. And there are tons of colors hidden there. You can scroll through using those little arrows or click that hamburger menu and choose from a whole bunch of pre-made palettes.
A whole rainbow of possibilities. Awesome. Now, at the very bottom, we've got that unassuming little bar.
The status bar.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate it. It's packed with information. The selected object's properties, what layer you're on, zoom level, even if your canvas is rotated. Keep an eye on that little guy. He's helpful. Oh, and of course, we can't forget layers. Usually tucked away in a panel, but crucial for organization.
Layers, right? Like those transparent sheets you stack up. We'll definitely come back to those. But first, let's make some shapes. Inkscape's got those tools built right in: rectangles, ellipses, stars, polygons, the basics.
The foundations of everything. You grab a tool, click and drag, release the mouse, and there's your shape. Now, when you select a shape, you get those little handles around it. The square ones are for resizing, and then some shapes have special handles too. Like with a rectangle, you might see a circular handle for rounding the corners.
And you can get really precise with the dimensions and corner rounding using the controls bar, right? The sources were big on that. Precision is key.
Oh yeah. The controls bar has number fields where you can type in exact values. Super important when you need things to be just right, especially if you're working with specific measurements.
I can imagine. Now, speaking of precision, those modifier keys, Creole, Shift, Alt, those seem like they're pretty important in Inkscape.
They're like shortcuts to awesomeness. Holding Krill while you make a rectangle or ellipse will force it into a perfect square or circle. Same with resizing. Hold Krill and it keeps the original proportions. No weird stretching. And with rotation, Krill snaps the angle to 15 degrees. Super useful for those symmetrical designs or when you're making patterns.
So curl is all about constraints and snapping, keeping things tidy. What about shift?
Shift usually means you're working from the center. So if you're drawing a shape, holding shift makes it expand from the point where you clicked. Same with scaling, it scales in opposite directions from the center. And for rotation, shift can make it rotate around a different point, like the opposite corner.
So it's all about the center point and going in both directions. Cool. What about Alt?
Alt is a bit more unpredictable. It does different things depending on the tool and what you're doing.
Yeah.
With rotation, it can also snap to angles, like 50.
Interesting. Bit of controlled chaos, huh? Okay, so we've got shapes on our canvas. How do we add some color to these bad boys?
Easy peasy. Select your shape, then click any color in that color palette at the bottom. Bam, filled. Want an outline? Shift, click a color, and you've got a stroke.
Click for fill, shift click for stroke. Got it. And what if you want to change the stroke thickness or make it dashed or something?
For basic width, the status bar is your friend. It usually shows the current stroke width, and if you right-click, you can choose from a few common sizes. But for more control, you'll need to dive into the fill and stroke dialog, which we'll get to later.
Okay, cool. And what if you want to just get rid of the fill or stroke entirely?
See that little red X in the color palette? Click that to make the fill transparent. Shift-click for the stroke. Basically, you're telling Inkscape, hey, I don't want any color here.
Like a little color eraser. Neat. Okay, now things are getting a bit more complex. We've got multiple shapes overlapping. How do we decide which one is on top? Like a stack of papers in stacking order, right? Or Z order.
You got it. And Inkscape gives you a couple of ways to control that. First, the selector tool. Select your object, and in the controls bar, you'll see some arrow buttons: raise to top, raise, lower, lower to bottom.
So raise just bumps it up one level, lower drops it down, and to top or to bottom sends it all the way.
Exactly. Nice and intuitive. But for more complicated drawings, layers are your best friend.
Layers. Our virtual transparent sheets. How do those help with stacking order?
So with layers, you're basically organizing your drawing into separate stacks. The Layers and Objects dialog is where you manage all that. It's under the Layer menu. The order of the layers in that dialog is the stacking order on the canvas. Top of the list, front of the drawing. You can drag layers up and down to rearrange them.
So if I want this whole section to be on top, I just drag its layer to the top of the list.
You got it. And it gets even better. Within a layer, you can also rearrange individual objects, drag them up or down in that same dialog to change their order within the layer. Plus, you can hide layers, lock them, super useful for complex projects.
Hiding and locking, that's brilliant. Keeps things tidy and prevents accidental edits. And what about sublayers? The sources mentioned those briefly. What are those all about?
Sublayers are like folders within folders, but for layers. You drag one layer onto another and it becomes a sublayer. So if you hide or lock the parent layer, all sublayers go with it. Really useful for organizing complex objects, like characters with multiple parts.
Okay, so we've got our shapes, our layers. Now we need to be able to move them around, resize them, rotate them. That's where the selector tool comes in, right? The Swiss Army knife of Inkscape.
Absolutely. The selector tool is your go-to for all basic manipulations. It's usually the first tool in the toolbox. Click to select, click and drag to select multiple objects, or shift-click to add to a selection, then just drag to move things around.
And we talked about scaling and rotating with modifier keys, but can you do those without Ctrl or Shift?
For sure. You select your object, and you see those handles around it. Corner handles for scaling, side handles for stretching. Now, to rotate or skew, you need to click the object a second time. Those handles will change, and you can drag to rotate or skew.
Double click for rotation and skewing. Interesting. The sources also mention a rotation center. What's that all about?
When you're rotating, you'll see a little crosshair in the middle of the object. That's the default rotation center. But you can click and drag that crosshairs anywhere, even off the object. Then, when you rotate, it'll pivot around that new point. Think of it like spinning a wheel around its axle.
Makes sense. So you can really control how things rotate, not just around their own center. And to reset it back to the middle, you just shift-click the crosshair.
Exactly. Super handy. Now, what about making copies? Inkscape has a few ways to do that, right?
Yeah, I remember seeing copy-paste, duplicate, and then there's this thing called clones.
All right, let's break it down. Copy-paste, that's your classic move. Ctrl plus C, Ctrl plus V, or use the menus. You get a completely independent copy, do whatever you want with it. Duplicate is similar, Ctrl plus D, but it puts the copy directly on top of the original. So it's there, but you won't see it move until you drag it.
So copy-paste is like, make a new one over there. Duplicate is like, make another one right here, but hidden for now.
Perfect analogy. Now, clones, those are special. They're like linked copies.
Yeah.
Make a change to the original, the clone changes too.
So if I change the color of the original, all the clones change color too.
Exactly. Really powerful for repeating elements or making variations of a design. And if you want to break the link, you just select the clone and go to Edit, Clone, Unlink Clone.
Okay, clones are like magic linked copies. Got it. Now, when you have a bunch of objects, sometimes you want them perfectly aligned or spaced out. That's where the Align and Distribute tools come in, right?
You know it. Go to Object Align and Distribute, and you can do all sorts of fancy alignment stuff. Align left edges, center them vertically, align to the bottom, tons of options.
The sources kept mentioning something about an anchor, though. What's that all about?
The anchor. That's what everything gets aligned to. You can align to the first selected object, the last selected, the biggest, the smallest, even the page itself. It's like the reference point.
Okay, so the anchor is like the magnet, and everything else gets pulled towards it.
Exactly. And then you have distribute options too. Distribute evenly horizontally, vertically, based on edges or centers. It's a lifesaver for creating visual rhythm and spacing things out perfectly.
And what if you want to align things visually, right on the canvas? There was something about snapping, right?
Snapping is your best friend for visual alignment. You turn it on with that little magnet icon at the top right. Then, as you move objects around, they'll snap to other objects, guidelines, the grid, the page edges. It's like magic.
So it takes the guesswork out of alignment.
Exactly. And you can customize what it snaps to using the snap controls right next to that magnet icon. Snap to bounding boxes, nodes, guidelines, the grid you choose. And there's an advanced mode too, if you want even more control.
Wow, that's powerful. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Interface, shapes, layers, manipulating objects. Now let's get to the heart of vector graphics paths. The sources were adamant that paths are the building blocks of everything in Inkscape.
No doubt about it. Paths give you that ultimate level of control. Inkscape has three main tools for creating paths: the calligraphy tool, the pencil tool, and the pen tool.
Let's start with calligraphy. What's that one all about?
The calligraphy tool is like having a digital brush pen. You can change the stroke width, the style, even choose from presets. It's awesome for that hand-drawn, organic feel.
Sounds perfect for adding a personal touch. What about the pencil tool?
The pencil tool is your freehand drawing friend. Just click and drag, and it creates a path following your mouse. And it has this cool smoothing feature, so if your hand's a bit shaky, you can smooth out the line afterwards. Makes it look all nice and clean.
So it's like sketch first, refine later, handy. Now the pen tool, that's the one that seems super important. What makes it so special?
The pen tool is the master of precision. It's how you create those perfectly smooth curves using Bezier curves. You click to create straight segments, click and drag to create curves with those little handles that control the shape. It takes a bit of practice, but once you get it, it's like having superpowers.
Yeah, Bezier curves, those can be tricky at first, but mastering them is definitely worth it.
So once you've started a path with the pen tool, how do you actually finish it?
If you want a closed shape, just move your cursor back to the very first point you created. We'll usually change to a circle or something, showing you can close the path. Click, and you've got a closed shape, ready to be filled with color. To leave it open, just right-click or hit Enter. Okay, pen tool for precision and curves. Got it. Now, paths are made up of these points called nodes, right? And you use the node tool to manipulate them.
Exactly. The node tool is usually right below the selector tool. You select your path, and those nodes appear as little squares or diamonds. You can click and drag them to reshape the path. And holding Control will often constrain the movement, so you can make really precise adjustments.
I remember seeing different types of nodes mentioned: corner, smooth, symmetric, auto smooth. What's the difference between all those?
Each node type controls how the path curves through that point. Corner nodes, they're the ones with those diamond shapes. They create sharp angles because the handles on either side move independently. Smooth nodes, those are the square ones. They make nice flowing curves because the handles are linked. Move one, the other mirrors it.
Makes sense. So smooth nodes for gentle curves, corner nodes for sharp turns. What about symmetric and auto smooth?
Symmetric nodes are a special kind of smooth node, where the handles are always the same distance from the node. Makes perfectly balanced curves. And auto smooth nodes, those are like the ultimate smooth operators. You move them, and the handles adjust themselves to try to make the smoothest curve possible.
So they're like self-adjusting for maximum smoothness. Cool. What if you need to change the type of a node after you've created it? Like, what if you need a sharp corner where there's a smooth curve?
The node tool's got you covered. In the controls bar, you'll find buttons for converting between node types. Click a smooth node, hit the corner button, bam, sharp corner. Super easy.
And what if you need more detail in a specific part of your path? Can you add or remove nodes?
Absolutely. To add a node, you can select two existing nodes and then click the Insert New Node in Selected Segments button in the Node Tool controls bar. It'll add a node right in the middle of that segment. And if you just want to add a node anywhere on a segment, you can double-click on that segment.
So clicking adds in between existing nodes, double-clicking adds anywhere you want.
Got it. What about removing nodes? To get rid of a node, simply select it with the Node tool and hit the Delete key. Poof, it's gone. But be careful, deleting nodes can significantly change the shape of your path, so make sure you're happy with the result before you commit.
Always good to have that undo button handy,
Yeah.
just in case. Okay, we're getting deep into paths here. Now, the sources mention that sometimes you want to take an existing shape, like a rectangle or a circle, and turn it into a path so you can have more control over its points and curves.
That's a really common workflow, and it's surprisingly easy. You select your shape, then go to Path, Object to Path, or you can even do it right from the Node Tool controls bar. There's usually a button there for it.
So either through the Path menu or the Node tool. Got it. But there was a caveat in the sources, something about losing certain handles.
Ah, yes, that's important. When you convert a shape to a path, you lose those shape-specific handles. Like if you had a rectangle with rounded corners, those little circular handles for rounding will disappear. However, don't worry, there's a workaround. There's this awesome tool called Add Corners LP, which you can find in the Node Tool controls bar.
LP, what does that stand for?
Live Preview. It means you can see the effect happening in real time as you adjust the settings. So at Add Corners LP, you can actually round the corners of your path after you've converted it from a shape. It gives you a lot of control, even over the type of corner rounding fillets, inverse fillets, chamfers, all sorts of fun stuff.
So you can regain that corner rounding control even after converting to a path. That's great. Now let's talk about the fun stuff, path operations. Inkscape calls these Boolean operations. They're in the path menu, and they let you combine and manipulate paths in all sorts of crazy ways.
Boolean operations are like path surgery. You're cutting, merging, slicing, dicing, all with paths.
Sounds intense. Let's break down some of these operations. What's a union?
A union is like path marriage. You select two or more paths or shapes, hit union, and they become one big happy path. Any overlapping areas are merged together, nodes get combined, the whole thing becomes a single entity.
So it's like taking two puzzle pieces and melting them into one. What about difference?
Difference is like a cookie cutter. You've got your cookie dough, which is the bottom object, and your cookie cutter, which is the top object. Hit difference, and the top object cuts its shape out of the bottom object. The top object disappears, and you're left with a hole in the bottom one.
I'm starting to see where that surgery analogy comes from. Okay, what about intersection?
Intersection is all about finding the common ground. You select your objects, hit intersection, and only the areas where they overlap remain. Everything else vanishes. It's like finding the shared space between two ideas.
So it's like, what do these two shapes have in common? And exclusion seems to be the opposite.
You're right. Exclusion is like what's unique about each shape. You hit exclusion, and it keeps everything except the overlapping areas. It's like highlighting the differences.
Interesting. And then there's division. That one sounds a bit more complex.
Right. Division gets a bit wild. It's like cutting the top object out of the bottom, but then keeping all the little pieces that were overlapping as separate paths. It's like breaking something into its smallest components.
Okay, division is definitely one to experiment with. What about cut path? That sounds pretty self-explanatory.
It is. Cut path cuts the stroke of the bottom object into pieces wherever it's overlapped by the top object. It's like taking scissors to a line and snipping it at specific points.
So it's all about dividing the stroke, not the fill. And then there's combine. How's that different from union?
Combine is like forming a team. It takes all your selected objects and turns them into a single object, but with multiple subpaths. So they're all part of the same team, but they retain their individual outlines.
So they're united but distinct. Got it. And then break apart seems to be the reverse of that.
Yep. Break apart takes combined object and splits it back into its individual subpaths. And here's a cool thing. If any of those subpaths formed a closed shape, it will automatically fill in the enclosed area.
So it can actually create new filled areas. That's neat. What about split path?
Split path is similar to break apart, but it only separates subpaths that aren't overlapping. So if you have two circles that are completely separate, split path will make them two independent objects. But if they're overlapping, it won't do anything. And it won't fill in any enclosed areas either.
Okay, so it's more about separating distinct elements. And then we have fracture and flatten. Those sound pretty destructive.
They can be, depending on what you're going for. Fracture takes all your overlapping objects and breaks them into little fragments based on where they overlap. It's like shattering something into a million pieces.
Wow, that could get messy fast.
And flatten. Flatten is like taking a steamroller to your drawing. It removes all the overlapping parts of the selected objects, leaving only the outermost outlines. It's a way to create a simplified, flattened version of a complex arrangement.
So it's like taking a 3D object and turning it into a 2D silhouette. Cool. All right, we've survived path surgery. Let's move on to something a bit more guiding. I'm talking about guidelines and grids, those visual aids that can help you keep things organized and aligned.
Guides and grids are essential, especially when you're working on precise layouts or illustrations.
So how do you actually create guidelines in Inkscape?
Guidelines are super easy to add. First, you need to make sure the rulers are visible. Go to View, Show Hide, and check rulers if they're not already showing. Then, to create a guideline, just click on the top ruler and drag downwards to create a horizontal guideline. Drag from the left ruler to create a vertical one. And you can even create diagonal guidelines by dragging from the corners of the rulers.
So click and drag from the rulers, got it. And those guidelines, they're magnetic, right? Things can snap to them.
Exactly. If you have snapping enabled, you can make objects snap to your guidelines. And in the snap controls, you can even choose to snap to specific guidelines or types of guidelines.
Handy. Now, what if you need to move a guideline after you've created it?
Just hover over the guideline, and your cursor will change to a little hand icon. Click and drag to reposition it. And if you hold down Shift while dragging, you can rotate the guideline. Alt plus drag will rotate it around its origin point only. You can also double-click on a guideline to open up the guideline dialog, where you can adjust its label, color, origin, angle, and you can even lock it.
So double-click for advanced control?
Nice. Yeah. What about locking all the guidelines? The sources mention that as a useful feature.
You got it. You can either go to the Edit menu and choose Lock All Guidelines, or there's usually a little lock icon between the rulers that you can click. And to unlock them, you just click the icon again, or go back to the Edit menu and choose Unlock All Guidelines.
And if you want to get rid of a guideline, easy peasy. Just drag it all the way back to the ruler where it came from, or select it and hit Delete. And if you want to nuke all the guidelines at once, go to Edit, Delete All Guidelines.
Okay, guidelines mastered. What about grids? How are those different and how do you use them?
Grids are basically a system of lines that can help you align objects. By default, Inkscape has a rectangular grid that's 1 pixel by 1 pixel. You can see it by going to View, Page Grid. If it's not checked, the grid is hidden.
And objects can snap to those grid lines too, right?
Absolutely. If snapping is enabled, objects will snap to the grid points. You can also customize the grid settings by going to File, Document Properties, Grids.
So document properties is where we go to tweak all the grid stuff. What kind of customizations can we make?
You can create new grids, either rectangular or axonometric, which is a type of perspective grid. You can adjust the spacing between the grid lines, change the origin point of the grid, even rotate it for those axonometric grids. You can also enable or disable the visibility of the grid and whether objects snap to it. And there are minor grid lines too, which are just finer lines that appear when you zoom in. And you can choose whether those are snappable as well.
Wow, that's a lot of grid control.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about colors. We've already touched on basic filling and stroking with the color palette, but the sources dug a bit deeper into color management in Inkscape.
Yeah, the color palette is great for quick color changes. But when you want more fine-grained control, the fill and stroke dialog is where it's at. You can open it by going to Object, Fill, and Stroke.
So it's like the advanced color settings panel. What can we do in there?
It has 3 tabs: Fill, Stroke Paint, and Stroke Style. In the Fill tab, you can choose the fill color for your selected object. And you have a ton of options for how to choose that color. You can use HSL values, RGB values, CMYK values. You can pick a color from the color wheel. You can even adjust the alpha value, which is the opacity or transparency of the fill. And of course, you can also choose no fill if you want your object to be transparent.
So it's like every way you could possibly imagine choosing a color. What about gradients and patterns? Can we apply those as fills?
You bet. In that same Fill tab, you have options for both gradients and patterns. You can create linear gradients, radial gradients, even conical gradients, which radiate out from a point. And you have full control over the colors, the transitions, the opacity of the gradient.
Gradients are definitely a fun way to add depth and visual interest. What about patterns?
Patterns are amazing too. You can choose from a bunch of built-in patterns or create your own. And you can adjust things like the scale, orientation, offset, and even the colors of some patterns. It's like having a library of textures at your fingertips.
Sounds like a great way to add detail without having to draw everything by hand. Now, the Stroke Paint tab, that's where you control the stroke color, right?
Yep, same idea as the Fill tab. You can choose your color using all the same methods: HSL, RGB, CMYK, the color wheel, alpha value, and you can also choose no stroke if you don't want any outline.
Okay, so Stroke Paint is for the color, and then Stroke Style is for, well, the style of the stroke.
You got it. In the Stroke Style tab, you can adjust the width of the stroke, make it dashed with different dash patterns and offsets, add markers to the stroke like arrows or dots, control the join style of the stroke, like whether it's mitered, beveled, or rounded, and adjust the cap style, which is how the ends of the stroke look. And you can even control the stacking order of the stroke relative to the fill.
Wow, that's a lot of stroke options. And I remember seeing something about an eyedropper tool, which seemed pretty handy.
Oh yeah, the eyedropper is a lifesaver. It lets you pick up colors from your canvas. So if you see a color you like, just select the eyedropper tool from the toolbox and click on that color. Boom, you've got that color selected.
So it's like a color thief.
Exactly. And you can shift-click with the eyedropper to pick up the stroke color instead of the fill color. You can even drag the eyedropper to get an average color from a selected area.
That's super useful for matching colors precisely. Now, the sources also mentioned something about blend modes, blur, and opacity. Those seem like they could get pretty complex.
They can, but they're also incredibly powerful for achieving certain visual